Leviticus. Isn't it your favorite book of the Bible? My name is Jacob Hubbard, and this is Incarnate Ministries brought to you by St. Thomas Aquinas in Pilot Point, Texas. And this is our third video in our little mini-series on the spirit of the liturgy. So today's video is on the liturgy as a liturgy of hope. And a really key interpretive tool is Leviticus. And so in Leviticus, we see a kind of self-enclosed liturgical circle. We see an answer for kind of every problem and every question that the Israelites could have had in regard to what they were supposed to do if this happened or that happened. We see liturgical rites. We see animal sacrifices. We see how the priests are supposed to be ordained. We get a sense of the rules and the regulations and the ways to deal with any sort of circumstance that the Israelites might find themselves in. And in doing so, we see that there's kind of this enclosed circle, right? It seems almost that the Ten Commandments, interpreted by Leviticus, is complete in of itself until we get to Leviticus 26. Leviticus chapter 26, it warns of punishment if the covenant is broken. And it also speaks of a future promise that itself has not been realized yet. The promise on which all sacrifices are made now, right? We talked about in the first video about how Abraham was able to sacrifice the ram because it was provided for by God. And it was symbolic of the ultimate sacrifice that was going to also be provided for by God. A sacrifice that was not yet there, but was the promise by which they were able to sacrifice in the Old Testament, right? And we all know now that that sacrifice which they waited for was Jesus. And it's true that his one act on the cross redeems the whole of reality. From all the way back to the beginning to all the way in the end, Jesus' act redeems. But we see that the liturgy of the Old Testament was a liturgy of hope, right? It was hoping through symbols in a reality that was not yet there, right? And we see Moses say that God will raise up for you a prophet from your brethren, just as he raised me up. And in saying that, he was saying that just as he established the temple worship, right? Just as he physically completed the covenant of the Lord, he made the Ark of the Covenant and brought it into completion and established that covenant with the Lord, the covenant of worship. So too was another prophet going to be raised up that was going to complete what Moses had begun and bring everything into completion in himself, right? And so the temple worship itself was always aware of its insufficiency, right? Its inability on its own to stand. It relied on God in order for it to be fulfilled. It was a liturgy of hope. And the temple was inadequate in another way, right? And we can see that very clearly in the words of the prophet Amos, which we'll turn to now. I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and cereal offerings, I will not accept them, and the peace offerings of your fatted beasts I will not look upon. This quote, it makes it seem like all of Israel's liturgies were an apostasy, like the golden calf. They were forged by man rather than by God, right? It just makes it seem like it was all misdirected and horrible. And the Lord there is being so pointed because he's trying to show the Israelites that it wasn't just about their physical giving, right? And the offerings in the temple and sacrificing the lambs and the rams, but it was also about their interior sacrifice, right? It was about their hearts. And so we see this duality of inadequacy in the temple, right? On the one side, the inadequacy of the liturgy because it used symbols that themselves were not actually attained yet, right? And then on the other side, the inadequacy of the heart, that the Israelites, their hearts weren't converted to the Lord, and they were doing these sacrifices in empty ways. And so understanding the temple's whole inadequacy and almost misdirection, doesn't it make so much more sense then why the Lord Jesus came in to the temple and cleansed it, right? He came in with whips and drove out the tax collectors. And what Jesus drove out were actually parts of the rites of the old covenant. And so it wasn't like they were doing anything really that wrong. But what he was doing was symbolically cleansing the temple, showing them that the old covenant wasn't really what the people needed, but the new covenant, right? And we can take this even further when we know that in all the Gospels, Jesus is accused of saying that he will destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, right? Now, he never actually says this, but in the Gospel of John, he does say, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it. And what's he saying here, right? He's accusing them. He's saying they will destroy the temple, and then he will rebuild it in 3 days. His accusers will destroy the temple. And it's here that we learn that the temple is his body, right? That they were going to destroy upon the cross, and in 3 days he was going to rise from the dead. And in doing so, he was going to fulfill what the old covenant was waiting for, right? He was going to be the interpretive key, the symbol upon which all other symbols were based, right? And he was going to have the hearts that unified us back to our Father, so that we all could access God through Jesus' own sacrifice of his body and his soul. So we no longer worship with symbols that represent a far-off reality. We worship with God, God himself, who's chosen to take the form of the symbol. The new symbol is not a symbol that's hinged upon a future reality that has not yet been attained. The new symbol is itself a manifestation of that which it desires to attain, right? And so it is with us whenever we act out in love now. By our baptismal identity, whenever we act with God's love, we are a symbol that actually expresses God's love. It's not just some future reality that we will express when we die. No, in that moment right there, we express the fullness of God's love through our symbolic action. And this is why the Mass is full of symbols. It's full of physical actions that themselves are a manifestation of God's real and actual love, right? They're not just some empty symbol. They're real manifestations. The bread that we receive is actually God. It's not just some fake symbol. It's not some symbol that awaits some future reality. No, in that moment, it is the reality of God through a mystery, right? And it's so beautiful. But the question may arise, do we even need the temple rite anymore? Do we need to go to Mass? Do we need to have all this time where we physically express through symbols this spiritual beauty, right? This spiritual transformation, this restitution to God? Do we need this? And, even in Israelites' own history, we saw that for a long period of time, they were without the temple. In the Babylonian exile, it was the tears, it was the groaning of the people that became their prayer. It was their heart, right? The psalmist says, my sacrifice is a contrite heart. A humbled, contrite heart you will not spurn, right? It's a transformation from this liturgical temple sacrifice, because the temple was destroyed. All the people had left was their own hearts to give to the Lord. Isn't that enough now that the temple has been destroyed and rebuilt, and that Jesus himself is the temple? Isn't it enough for us just to kind of turn our hearts interiorly to God? Even in the early church, we actually did see this theme. We saw that the Eucharist was called oratio, which means prayer. And so that was tied in with the notion of logos. And the early church fathers interpreted the Eucharist as the logos for us, by which we were able to have a perfect prayer in our own soul through the power of God's word, right? So that we receive the word, so that our very souls could then become a word of prayer to the Lord that was desirable and that was perfect, right? And so it kind of left out the whole bodily side. But to leave the Eucharist simply in the realm of the Spirit is fundamentally to still fall into the same critique of the Gnostics, right? Of Gnosticism, the early church heresy that we talked about, right? It's to believe that matter is evil in a sense, and untransformed and unredeemed. No, we know that God created everything and created everything good, and that he desires to express himself, to make himself known in the simple, right? And so that's why we have both body and soul. They go together, right? And that distinction there, right? If there's any tension there, it's dissolved in the Eucharist, and where the perfect word takes on body, the simple body. And he transcends that distinction so that we too can learn to transcend it and see that it's only when our actions, our prayer enters into the realm of physical action, of physical expression, of a physical symbol, that it becomes complete. And again, this is the crux of incarnational theology itself, right? It's only when our mental or interior conversion makes itself known exteriorly that it is actual, right? Because it is then that it becomes a symbol through which God's love is manifest to the world at large, much like the Old Testament symbols were, and especially like the Eucharist is now. And our symbol is much like the Eucharist, not like the Old Testament symbols, because our symbols in action, in praying out loud, and standing and kneeling in the liturgy, and responding and being physically here, and then outside of the liturgy and doing acts of service for the Lord and praying on our own. All of those acts, they actually manifest God's love because of our baptismal identity, where he dwells in fullness within us. How amazing is that? So worship is no longer divided between the exterior temple and the interior word or logos or prayer, right? That distinction has been dissolved in the Eucharist so that we can unite them together in a full, beautiful prayer as God really intends for us. So that in liturgy, our interior disposition of receiving God's own love and sacrifice for us has an exterior expression. And the combination of that interior and that exterior is the fullness of prayer that God desires for us. And when we go to Mass, we shouldn't just be locked inside of ourselves, never saying any words, never participating physically in the Mass, right? And we also shouldn't be just doing the exterior without knowledge and understanding of what's really going on interiorly, without that humility, that reception of God's own paschal sacrifice for us, right? We need a logos-driven liturgy, but that liturgy still needs to be physical, because by being physical, it is complete. And it also means that our liturgy is still a liturgy of hope, right? We look forward at the reality of the second coming, right? But we already actually receive the fullness of God through the simple symbols, right? It's not a liturgy of an incomplete hope, but it's a liturgy of a full hope that knows that just as God has taken care of everything and is taking care of everything, so will he bring the entirety of the cosmos to completion in himself. We're dealing with his fullness, right? These symbols aren't waiting for completion. They are themselves the completion by which we see that God is bringing everything back to himself, that he is the manifestation in the Mass of that which we hope for. We're kind of caught in between the already and the not yet. And we should realize that in the liturgy, we not only hope, but we receive what we hope for, right? But that's also drive us on toward more completion, toward perfection, right? Because we know that God has promised that. And he gives us the means to that perfection physically in the Eucharist. And so in the Mass, we see through the Eucharist, which is offered up in front of all of us, the interpretive key for the entirety of reality. A reality that pushes onward toward completion because it already has been completed by God's paschal sacrifice. And all we need to do is continue to trust in his infinite love and mercy that will bring us to the fullness of redemption, of joy, and completion. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful day.